Thank you so much for being here, especially with all the hurdles that come with trying to get on campus right now. And apologies for the delay because of that. So my name is Sebastian Lauer. I'm the department coordinator at the Rochester Education Justice Initiative, also known as REGI. For the University of Rochester, REGI works to ensure that the institution does its fair share in educating individuals incarcerated in our region. We currently offer associate's degrees in Attica, Wyoming, and Groveland, and have just launched our first bachelor degree program in Attica. REGI also creates pathways for returning citizens to continue higher education after release through our Justice Scholars Program, and we support decarceral efforts at the University of Rochester and in the community. In my spare time, I also organize with Decarcerate Rochester, a community coalition led by activists, formerly incarcerated folks, and advocates committed to prison abolition and liberation. It's with great pleasure to have Doran Larson joining us here in Rochester to discuss his new book, Inside Knowledge, Incarcerated People and the Failures of the American Prison. Doran Larson is Edward North Professor of Literature at Hamilton College. He led a writing workshop inside Attica Correctional Facility from 2006 to 2016. He is the founding organizer of the AA degree granting Attica Genesee Teaching Project and of the award-winning AA degree granting Hamilton Kirkmer College of Prison Program at Mohawk and Mid-State Correctional Facilities. He is the author of Witness in the Era of Mass Incarceration, Discovering the Ethical Prison. He is the editor of Fourth City Essays from the Prison in America, the largest print collection to date of nonfiction essays by currently incarcerated people, writing about their experience inside. He founded and now co-directs the American Prison Writing Archives, a Mellon-funded and fully searchable digital archive of over 5 million words of first-person prison witness. His new book, Inside Knowledge, was published by NYU Press in January. Additionally, we would like to thank Doran for his pioneering efforts with higher education in Attica, which helped lay the groundwork for the thriving associate and bachelor's degree programs REGI now has in the prison. His thoughtful, rigorous, student-centered approaches to pedagogy is still part of the DNA of our program. Now I'll let Doran take it away, and thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thanks to Sebastian, Allison, Don, everybody who worked to put this together. I was a little worried when I realized that there was a protest going on, because obviously I don't want to cross, a line of any kind. But we have to remember that while we're fighting against colonialism abroad, we need to fight against colonialism domestically as well. And this book is really very much about doing exactly that. Also, the protest took me back to the late 1970s when I was in college. We were protesting a different apartheid in South Africa. And students were doing the same things. They were not being violently treated, partly because largely because there was a lot of white students who were leading that. Now these movements that are led by non-white people, the police are, on them immediately. And we're also in the post 9/11 era. Of course, it's changed everything. So tonight I'm going to be talking right up front. I'm going to talk briefly about the book, but the background to the book. The way it grew out of the American Prison Writing Archive, where the archive came from, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and then open it up for questions and responses. For those of you who are not here, I have a handout for everyone in here, and I encourage you to go to prisonwitness.org, it's PRISON, witness.org, which is the site for the American Prison Writing Archive. So, all of my work in prison started at Attica when I initiated the writing workshop that was mentioned. 2006, I really stumbled into this. I met a man in Buffalo who was part of a group called CBUS, and it was folks on the outside who go in and talk to a circle of men inside about just coping with being in prison. It was started up shortly after the uprising of 1971 because the folks inside wanted more contact with the community. The way that the workshop got started was that I went into that group for like 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 sessions. And I was so profoundly moved by the level of conversation in that room, the issues people were dealing with, the honesty with which they approached them, that I wanted to come back, but my teaching schedule changed. It wouldn't work with that schedule. So I said, what if I do something that works on my schedule? I'll start a writing workshop, because I've been a writing teacher for over 20 years at the time. Interestingly, the only thing they were worried about, like, when do you want to do it, right? It's all about scheduling, right? They didn't ask what I was going to do. They didn't ask what the people were going to write. They did not ask what I intended to do. It was just a program that they could claim to the state. We're doing programming because this person's coming in for free, right? And offering these services, which prisons typically do. So that class went on, as mentioned, for 10 years. The reason it lasted so long really was because the men who joined that group kept coming back. One of whom is in this room, Jose Di Lanola. I had men who came and went, over the course of months. If it had been constantly, that kind of turnover, I don't know that I would have stayed. But really, a core of about 6 men, or 7 actually, stayed and came in for years and years and years. And having taught at colleges and universities, for many years before this, it was really a remarkable thing, not only to work in the prison, but also to be able to work with people for 2 or 3 years, not for the 15 weeks which you're supposed to turn somebody into a writer, which is virtually impossible. So we had men in there, who came in, almost unable to articulate their ideas, create a legible sentence. And by the time they were done, they were getting their work in print. So it was really gratifying work, and their commitment was really what kept me going back. The college program started because I thought at the time that I was going to move from the area, and I didn't want there to be no secular education going on. There's not. I got a GED class. So that's when I started talking to people about organizing the college program. I learned something about that I applied to organize the program in Central New York, is get the men who are in charge on board and then deal with the women who actually do the work, right? Pass the paper back and forth, set a curriculum, right? Get approvals and all that. So once those folks were in conversation, it kind of, took off by itself. So my efforts were really upfront, and really credit goes to the folks who are working in administration at the prison and at Genesee Community College, where it originally started. So the class itself, for anybody who's taught in prisons, this is something I think you see pretty immediately. I came in with no conception other than what most people gather from popular media about incarcerated people, which of course is largely gross misrepresentation. What I found were men who virtually all had taken full responsibility for their crimes. They virtually all had violent crimes. And they were literally day by day carrying the weight of what they'd done on their backs. And to move on, what I observed was that to move on from that experience and to, think about, a life after that requires a level of self-reflection and analysis that you don't see outside of recovery circles, right? So these men were doing this profound internal work at the same time that they were living inside Attica and daily for years on end, witnessing what the state can do to citizens when there are no videos around, right? Because this is a closed institution. It was conceived in, as that way in the 18th century. And it quickly became apparent if I could simply help them write clearly about both the internal experience they're going through and the things that we're witnessing, they were going to produce documents that were invaluable to the world outside. And their publication record certainly bears that out. One of the men in the class, Adam Roberts, had a book that came out in 2016, got great reviews, NPR, book list, all the places you want to be reviewed. Another man in that class, John J. Lennon, has turned himself into a working journalist. You may have read his work. He's been in the New York Times. He's a contributing editor at Esquire. And some of the top literary journals, the cumulative resume would certainly get somebody tenure, right? At any, decent college. Even a very rigorous place. And then I wanted to start a undergraduate course where I teach at Hamilton on American prison writing. And I looked around, there was no broad sampling of nonfiction by currently incarcerated people. There are collections done by Joy James, for example, on political prisoners, political writing, histories of what you call neo-slave narratives. But they were very focused and very specialized. I just wanted a broad sampling of what are people experiencing now. That ended up creating this book, Fourth City, Essays from the Prison of America. It's 71 essays from 27 states. Jose's essay about being in the New York State prison system at the age of 17 and making his way there is in the essay. It's a really, really beautiful piece. And students often just fall to that one because, right, it's the age they are, right, when they're in my classes. So the deadline for that book passed in the fall of 2012, and essays just kept coming, and they just kept coming. And often they have a cover letter saying, I know your deadline is passed. I know you're not going to publish this, but I want somebody to read my story, right? And they were, what I was experiencing was just this weight of responsibility. Like I'd opened this door and people were rushing in and I had no place. It took me several years to find a publisher, for this book. So happily, a colleague at Hamilton had just landed a grant from the Mellon Foundation to start digital humanities projects. So this was a natural development for that. So the archive's been growing now for 12 years in total. But I want to go back to the title of Fourth City. When I put the book together, I didn't have a title for it yet. But the thing that became apparent when the work was coming in is that even though we have over 5,000 confinement facilities in the United States, and they spread across the map, obviously all 50 states and the District of Columbia, when you read the work that comes from there, you cannot tell they're not in the same place. It's remarkable, even though incarcerated people have a very difficult time actually communicating with each other, right? Often it's barred, right? They can't do that. They kept writing about the same things and finding the same phenomena, inadequate medical care, horrendous, medical abuse, abuse by guards, horrible food, lack of hygiene, et cetera, et cetera. So at the time, the prison and jail population in the United States was just behind the population of Chicago. So in numbers, it would constitute the fourth largest city in America. But the testimony was coming out or suggesting that the experience of incarceration, though spread across the nation, is actually more coherent than you would expect if you surveyed people, what's it like to live in LA, right? Or New York or Chicago. Because, one important dimension of freedom is to be able to live differently, even in the same place, right? Where the folks who are incarcerated are living remarkably similar lives, right? Given the similar conditions under which they're restricted. Again, the deadline passed. The archive's been growing since then. It was at Hamilton College. Hamilton is an 1,800 student teaching college. I realized after several years they were not going to have the bandwidth to support this research project because teaching is our focus. So I went shopping around for an R1 institution, larger institution that could support it. It ended up at Johns Hopkins University, which is where it's housed now in their Sheridan libraries. And with another Mellon Foundation, now it's allowed us to grow to the size that we are now. At the current moment, there are the equivalent in the archive of 70 volumes, this size, right? 70. And it grows by close to a full volume this size every month. So it's growing at an incredible rate. And a stat that I think is important to think about is that the word count that's now in the archive is the equivalent of nearly 70% of all known North American slave narratives. So within a predictable number of years, we'll have more first-person narrative about mass incarceration that exists about American slavery, right? And that's just ours. That's just our archive. I mean, there are other places, right? All the work that's in Penn, for example. There are a number of other archives that are out there in the world. So the inside knowledge is actually just the first of 5 planned volumes that are going to grow out of the archive. Inside knowledge, after a first chapter, which is looking at the history of the prison and basically demonstrating this, the prison's been a sham from the beginning, right? Because it was all about creating isolation and there were no checks and balances built into it, as there were in other parts of government. It's essentially become an arena for mythologizing, right? Not unintentionally. And it goes back to the 18th century theorizing that was the foundation of that. It's continued now, even more so now, right? Now that people's ideas about prisons and incarcerated people are all on their screens, right? Usually produced by people who haven't got a clue about what actually goes on inside the institution. So the first volume, after that chapter, There are 4 chapters in the book, and they look at the way in which prisons not only do not achieve their 4 rationales for existing, but actively defeat them. They defeat retribution, strangely enough that might seem, but I argue that that's the case. Deterrence, containment, and rehabilitation, of course, all right, given the state that things are in. And then the final chapter looks at or suggests ways in which the writing of incarcerated people might be incorporated, for example, in law schools, into public discourse, and hoping to move public action, right, and policy. We have 4 more volumes that are planned. Elizabeth Hinton and Elsa Laura at Yale University are actually now working on a volume on violence, the way it intervenes and intersects and grows out of the lives of incarcerated people. Heather Ann Thompson, the author of Blood in the Water, Pulitzer Prize-winning history of Attica, is going to be editing a volume on conditions and resistance to them. Ken Hartman did 38 years in the California prison system, and an editorial board, including currently incarcerated people. We're going to be putting a volume together about prison in California, right? That is like, and Michelle Alexander is going to edit a volume looking at what justice, freedom, and liberation mean to incarcerated people. So our effort is not just to accumulate as much work as we can, but also to disseminate that work, right? And to bring it into public discourse. And what our greatest ambition is really, to make it not, the prison, as mentioned, was sort of built essentially to isolate incarcerated people, to censor them, right? To keep them out of contact with the public. And our intent through the books and through the archive is essentially to make their witness unavoidable, right? So that no journalist can talk about what's going on in prison without feeling like I've got to include the voices of incarcerated people, right? This landscape has changed drastically since I started doing this work, just 18 years ago. There is much more responsible reporting about prison conditions, et cetera. A lot more investigative journalism going on there. And a lot more work by people inside the Prison Journalism Project. That website is basically turning itself into a venue for teaching incarcerated people to be professional journalists, right? And bringing their work out. So that is changing. And what ultimately the hope is that in the same way that a radical transformation took place in the public images of incarcerated people around the early 70s, between the Second World War and that period, there was a general sense that incarcerated people were people who had tough lives, and if you help them out, they would come out, they could be productive citizens. With the rise of the Black Power movement, particularly, and also coinciding with a whole string of high-profile serial killers, there was this transformation. These are people just need to be locked up, right? Because either they don't accept the legal system, right, on ideological grounds, or they're nuts, right? So we just need to hold them and hold them and hold them. And as it points out in the opening chapter, there was a whole lot of invested interest in doing this. Prison profiteers, people who build prisons, supply prisons, the war on drugs, of course, militarized local police, and they could, as you don't know, the war on drugs, the federal government would give money to local precincts if they made a priority of drug enforcement, even if that wasn't their major problem, right? If their major problem was, serial rapes, right, or murder or something else, if they focused on drug violations, they would get federal money. So obviously they went where the money was, right? And it was really about just pumping numbers of people inside the system. So the effort in some sense is just to shift the public consciousness about incarcerated people. And as many people will say, the fundamental thing is to say incarcerated people are people, period. If we accepted that idea, we would be in a whole different place, right? In terms of where we are. And also people ask, like, what would be the most fundamental shift we could see? And I really learned this and saw it in action from touring a lot of prisons in Northern Europe. That is to make our system forward-looking rather than backwards-looking, right? Our system's entirely backwards-looking. You did this, you deserve this much pain. It's going to take 25 years to get this much pain out of you. There's some sort of magical formula. This is going to balance out the pain, that the victim suffered or the family suffered. In European systems, they only attend to what you did. Insofar, it's a reference point for thinking about how are we going to move you into the world outside, right? And two particular policies, which I wish we had here, would be important for that. And the college programs are actually an instance of this. One is called normalization. That is, you try to make life inside prison as much like life outside as you can, because you're preparing people to go outside. And two, it's called the import model. When somebody's getting educated or they're getting medical treatment, they don't get it from somebody who's a prison employee, but they get it from somebody who's in the community and comes in and delivers those services so that when that person goes out, they can stay with the same doctor, right? They can stay with the same teacher. So they feel like they're connected to the community, not the sense like this has to be the worst experience of your life, right? Because we have this, bizarre idea that if you just punish people more, they will stop doing what they're doing. If you look at the lives of the people who are incarcerated, these people, many of them have been punished from day one, right? Born into problem homes, violent homes, addicted homes, problem neighborhoods, et cetera. There's not a lot more suffering you can impose upon them that's going to change that. You're really just continuing this. This is really obvious when you look at the conditions for women in prison. 90% have been sexually or physically abused, right? And then they go inside and they are re-traumatized, right? Because we let males guard incarcerated women, right? And obviously it's not, an atmosphere which is going to do any healing in those particular circumstances. But, to an extent, it continues that for everybody who's incarcerated. So Ben, we were going to now have some folks come up and speak. Do you want to do this part?
Do you want to take a little break before we do that, or we're going to have a panel? And I was just going to ask some questions.
Okay. Oh, I'm going to read a little bit from the book, just from the opening of the book. Just a few pages here. And the first, the introduction of the book is called Why Prison Witness Matters. In 1974, on the cusp of the American prison's expansion toward its current mass scale, Justice William O. Douglas wrote that, quote, people have the right and the necessity to know not only the incidence of crime, but of the effectiveness of the system intended to control it, unquote. Popular media, political debate, and high-profile cases have made parts of the system the stuff of daily conversation. Arrest, charging, and courtroom procedures are practices of which most people feel they have at least some cursory understanding, however ill-informed they may in fact be. But TV dramas, news segments, and much of the public debate often end in arrest, arraignment, verdicts, or sentencing. The criminal legal system narratives we witness day to day typically conclude with a suspect handcuffed and pushed into a squad car or escorted from a courtroom, yet far from prison gates. The purpose of this book is to continue that storyline while allowing its living subjects to unmask its myths. Narrated by witnesses who can testify to the most hidden intricacies of its daily workings, Inside Knowledge allows readers to learn from the prison people what America's unprecedented experiment in mass-scale incarceration looks and feels and smells like from inside. It is not a flattering portrait. Imprisoned people with the courage and wherewithal to document what they experience make clear that today's prisons not only degrade and debilitate their wards, they defeat each of the missions we have traditionally asked prisons to fulfill: rehabilitation, containment, deterrence, and even meaningful retribution. These purposes are foundational to legitimizing the existence and operation of prisons, to rationalizing the policing and court systems that feed them, and to locating incarceration's place within democracy. If the mass prison actively defeats its own rationales and justifications for being, then rather than using them as the cardinal reference points in public debate about mass incarceration, we would do better to direct that debate to the mass-scale damage prisons mete out on individuals and communities. Such a redirected debate, as the voices gathered in this book suggest, can redirect and dismantle thinking about the future of incarceration itself as a method of securing not only legal order, but a constructive, equitable form of justice, one that serves all people and communities, rather than pitting citizens outside against those inside in a struggle that degrades everyone concerned. Incarcerated people today are ready for this renewed debate, and they know the stakes of their testimony. They know that every detail they convey must counter the fog and misinformation produced by popular media, a multi-billion-dollar prison industry, lawmakers beating the drums of law and order, and the perceptions of a public, in legal scholar Jonathan Simon's words, quote, whose infatuation with incarceration depends on deep ignorance as to its fundamental effects, unquote. What prison witnesses reveal is confined social order made up of people who, even when accepting their culpability, reject the destructive practices that their acts have triggered. Quote, I did something wrong. I deserve to go to prison, writes Brian Nelson after 27 years inside. I didn't deserve to be tortured, unquote. Our prisons teach profound lessons. They simply are not the ones we might like to believe are taught inside either a democratic nation claiming to respect human rights and dignity, or an institution intended to control crime. What incarcerated people report is that our prisons do not punish so much as they simply damage human beings, rendering them less capable of reintegrating into life outside. We then blame their failures on their lack of moral character. But as one imprisoned California writer observed in 1970, quote, to determine how men will behave once they enter the prison, it is of first importance to know that prison. Men are brutalized by the environment, not the reverse, unquote. And that's George Jackson, by the way, who's of course covered in the early history. 50 years later, a woman who served years in solitary confinement in New York State suggests that little has changed. Yes, quote, yes, the public is safe for that time while in prison, but now you have this menace who is developing a shitload of other problems. It's like taking a dog, putting it in a cage and mistreating it for years, and then letting it loose in a playground with children. It's going to act exactly how you'd expect it to act, unquote. From Tennessee, a letter addressed to American Justice concludes, quote, I thank you for the pain and unforgettable experiences, American Justice. I thank you for creating a beast, unquote. These voices join a history of prison testimony nearly as old as the nation itself. For over 220 years, incarcerated people have been producing a shadow canon to the famously unruly public texts of American literary history. This better-known canon presents facets of a nation so profoundly pluralistic that we take up each day, as fresh as at our founding, the question of just what we are and what we stand for. Meanwhile, imprisoned writers have built, year by year, decade by decade, a literary corpus that tracks the evolution of an institution that translates all of our most noble arguments about values, beliefs, justice, and the rule of law into steel and stone and concrete, into education or torture, into conditions for redemption or utter degradation. What legally confined people write of today offers haunting echoes of what others have written since 1799. That few know this is no accident, since, quote, the prison is, historian Dan Berger writes, a living archive steeped in a denial of the histories it combines, unquote. And yet people behind bars have documented the steady, disequalizing thrum of human suffering that underlies American claims to blind justice, equity, and the rule of law. These messages are not simply from in there. They unearth the silent foundation beneath the social and legal facts and culture that Americans call here.
So we're going to start our discussion portion, and I'm going to introduce our two new panelists that we're bringing on. First up is Allison Peterman. Allison is the director of Reggie's new BA program at Attica Correctional Facility and chair of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Rochester. She has taught at 5 Points, Attica, and Groveland, and along with colleagues at Reggie, helped design the BA curriculum. Last fall, she taught the first junior seminar for our first class of BA students at Attica. She works in the history of philosophy, philosophy of science, and philosophy of mind. And Jose de la Nola, at 16, Jose received a 26-year to life sentence for a second-degree murder, serving 18 years in Attica and other facilities. While incarcerated, he worked as a rehabilitation peer educator, mentoring in relapse prevention, anger management, and mental health. Jose co-founded the Attica Lifers organization, served as its president, and consulted for various organizations. In 2011, he received an honorable mention from PEN America for his piece, The Years in Between. His work has also been published in Stone Canoe. Jose was released in December 2021 and now advocates for clemency and parole reform in New York. He is the Clemency Campaign Director for the Release Aging People in Prison campaign, also known as RAP. actively involved in initiatives such as RAP, New York State Executive Clemency Assistance, and the New Yorkers for Clemency campaign. So please give them a round of applause.
Okay, I think I'm in charge now. So. Here. Okay, so actually you did some of my job already, so that's really great. I thought that was a really helpful introduction to your new book, Inside Knowledge. And I think as we saw, you really focused there on, you described kind of creating a meeting between people who are very intentional and kept apart, and that's incredibly valuable. And you focused there on this idea of firsthand testimony and witness, and I want to come back to that at one point, but because of that, I thought that probably the best way to organize this conversation is to give voice to the people who are inside, be they in your book, be they Jose who's experienced it inside, or and also Jose and Don have collected some questions and insights from two different people that they have a reading group with who are currently incarcerated. So I'm going to draw from those as well, if that's all right. Yeah. Okay, so the first question that I have is actually from one of the people in the reading group. So I'm just going to say a little bit about Paris before I present their question. So Paris is a genderqueer activist from Harlem who has been unjustly incarcerated for 20 years. Paris has facilitated anti-violence programs, reentry preparation courses, GED tutoring, and served as a mentor to many. They also work with the Newburgh LGBTQ+ Center, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, and the Inside Outside Coalition. Paris is currently enrolled in the Bard Master's Program, writing a senior thesis exploring how Black LGBTQ+ youth navigate safety, self-respect, and family dynamics. So, cool person. Okay, so Paris asks, how did writing this book change you? They write, quote, "These testimonies aren't easily shaken off, and I live amid these stories." I would add to Paris's question, how has learning about these experiences caused not just you, but also your whole project to evolve from the initial book through Fourth City to this current book?
Yeah. That's a good question. It's one thing I think is important. It's not as though I was doing this work and then I was influenced by incarcerated people. This really grew out of the work of incarcerated people. So when, as I mentioned, I went into Attica with no real knowledge, other than what generally people have about incarceration, incarcerated people. Learned from the folks inside about how the system worked and who they were. And then the book came about, and I learned the sort of ubiquity of the experience of incarcerated people. And then incarcerated people just kept writing. So in some sense, it's not as though I really didn't plan this project. It was rather just kind of keeping up with the incarcerated people to tell their stories. Right. So they've always been in the lead. And at the archive, we are very careful to only represent incarcerated people as they choose to represent themselves. So it's a fully searchable archive, so you can layer searches, on the website. But all that information that we use, it's called metadata, to populate those searches, is only the information those folks decide to represent. They can present no information about themselves, but their work will go up because we don't want to overrepresent. There's also the possibility of retaliation, et cetera. So it's less a matter of the work having shaped or informed me, or rather that it's literally sort of, it has always been in the lead, and then I've been responding to it, right? And once I started doing work in prisons, I did a lot of catch up on reading the secondary literature, right? The sociology, the criminology, et cetera, that's out there. And I've literally never come across an idea put forward by someone on the outside, which hasn't already been articulated by somebody inside, right? So the quote that I just gave, a quote from George Jackson, comes in 1970. And he's basically saying the things that Michelle Alexander documented in 2010, right? But he knows about he'd seen what she was talking about, right? 40 years earlier. And that's what I find over and over again. So it's really not a matter of my ideas being shaped as it is my ideas are coming into existence. Really just like managing and kind of being an MC to the writing of incarcerated people.
What about Paris's question? How did it change you? I think Paris wanted to know a bit more as they write. These testimonies aren't easily shaken off.
Yeah, it actually completely redirected my life with the work in prisons. It ended my first marriage because we probably needed to end because I just got so busy with this work, I didn't have time for a relationship. Two, I had been hired at Hamilton as a fiction writer, writing novels and short stories. I quit. I started at Attica in 2006. I quit writing fiction in 2008 because this felt to me much more important than that work. And even, sort of at a deeper psychological level, I was mentioning to you, virtually my earliest memories in life are of being inside an institution. I had radical experimental surgery when I was 4 years old. It actually saved my life from a previously incurable form of cancer. So literally sort of my earliest memories are of being an institution that everybody believes is a very benevolent, right? Everybody's glad they're a hospital when they're there, but what they also do to the people inside is cause them enormous amounts of pain. So there was a kind of, I could put it this way, literally like walking into my own psychodrama and actually being able to do something positive and then being able to walk out. So I think, it took years for me to figure out that was part of the motivation, but it really felt like I was actually healing myself every time that I went in there, deliver a class or organize something.
Actually, I'm going to ask a follow-up question since you mentioned having been a fiction writer. A lot of this book, and I think your previous books too, really focuses on, if you could call it a genre, testimony, right, and first-person witness accounts. I wonder if you could say a little bit about, so one way that you could also get to know people inside is by reading their literary works. So, and also just to talk maybe about how testimony and witness actually may be adequate or inadequate to describe what you're collecting. It has, of course, this very specific context, the context of criminal cases, usually, and of course, maybe victims are usually called to eyewitnesses or give testimony, but that seems a little bit strange, right? So it's actually, these are the victims of, I presume the prison system is on trial, right? This is certainly a condemnatory document. So, how do you just think about testimony and witness, and why is that? You've said a bit, but just talk a little bit about why that interests you as the primary form here.
The reason that I didn't want fiction in the archive is because I was thinking about it as a body of witness literature, and the public brings such immediate skepticism to the writing and testimony of incarcerated people. I didn't want there to be ambiguity to say, well, is this fiction? Is this nonfiction? Right? So no, as far as we can tell, right, and we have to trust the people who are writing. This is nonfiction. So that was this sort of logistical or mechanical reason for doing. One of the efforts or the hopes for this work is to put the writing of incarcerated people in the U.S. and elsewhere at the same level of moral legitimacy and importance that we give to other more traditionally titled witness literatures, slave narratives, Holocaust narratives, right? Now, there's an obvious distinction that people would obviously make. Well, these people were locked up, right, because of what they were, not for what they've done. This group is there for what they've done. But if you look at the demographic trends of who's being locked up, right, and the reasons for it, that distinction starts to fall away. And also, I'm teaching a course right now called Literature to Witness. We do Holocaust narratives, slave narratives, and now we're doing prison writing. And the students, are just making connections like crazy between the two. Any place where you have a locked institution where other people make decisions for everybody inside, whether or not this is, a step toward extermination or labor exploitation or, somebody's idea about justice, it's a remarkably similar situation. And when people say, well, what about people who've done really horrendous crimes? How can you give them a venue? I don't care why people are in the institution. I care about what they have to say about the institution and what their crime was to get them in, to me says nothing about their credibility as documentarians of that institution. Right? Primo Levi, the great Holocaust narrative memoirist, once said, there may have been people who died in the Holocaust who were terrible people. There might have been serial killers, but who is ever going to open that question? How would you dare open that question, given the horrendous, hindrance of the practice? And in that sense, I think if you're not going to ask that question, and you clearly cannot morally or ethically ask that question, I think that you can also then say it doesn't matter why people are here, right? It matters what they can tell us about the institution, and also in terms of the broad body of the work. I often tell my students and others is that no one person can tell the story of the prison. But when you read dozens and dozens of these essays and you find their testimony really coherent, then you're, reading aggregate really tells you something about the institution. Right. So.
I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Jose, as a writer. And, I think you've written both nonfiction kind of essay style and also fiction and academic writing. So is there one that you're drawn to that you feel like allows you more kind of expressive power? Has that changed since you've been out versus since you were in?
Yeah. So I was always a writer before, I went to prison. I was journaling thoughts and notes and just making sense of life, like many people do who write or use art or music or any of those type of things. And but it just wasn't it wasn't getting out what I was trying to get out. And then I enter prison and I get into the creative writing workshop with Doran and many of my closest friends that are in there that have been encouraging me to participate. And one of the first things that was expressed in this class is that your story matters. And I think about that in in any person's walk of life, whether you're in an institution or in a school where we are, or a home, your trauma and your story matters. Your life history matters. And so being able to tell that story. And how fortunate it is that even in the depth of Attica, which is, definitely the worst prison in New York State and arguably the country, there's an opportunity to tell your story and then finally do it in a way that starts healing. And so once I got into the writing workshop, a lot of my fantasy or other stuff just became less necessary, and there became this really strong imperative that I have to write. And I never really thought about what story I was going to write. It was just whatever came up, and then everything had to stop. So if I was working on a project, or if I was doing homework for a class, sorry professors or whatever, the minute an idea came for something to write, I had to stop everything. And I would literally stay up, almost through the night for days until at least a draft was done. Because I knew whatever thing I'm trying to get out, I need to get it out immediately, because my life has always been a one of holding and containing. And the thing about holding and containing through time is that we start looking at other things that we don't want to look at. So I think, now that I'm home, I have the time to write. I don't make the time. Everybody has the time to do stuff, whether they make the time to do it. I don't, but I have found other meaningful, outlets to bring, those same type of needs that I was looking to have met. So understanding of my own life, my own choices, how I dealt with them, contributing to understanding of other people's lives. So the work that I do, but I think for everybody, at least in that writing workshop, and I'm sure people in other places can relate, like having that space where it's encouraged and then fostered, and then like, like we learned like some amazing writing techniques. And yes, some of it was from Professor Larson, but some of it was from just the way he structured the group. It was just like, hey, like we all here have the idea of what sounds right, or what sounds makes sense, or what conveys a clear, like we all can help you, and be in this process. So it wasn't just like a curriculum or a lesson. It was like we're all reading a piece, and then like we're all talking about what was good or cool, or like that didn't work, or So yeah, that's kind of where my writing is at right now.
So interesting. It seemed to me like you all had to learn to give constructive criticism.
Yeah.
Because the atmosphere of the prison is, you speak against me, this is going to go out in the yard.
Yeah.
Right. So learning that you could give criticism, but it wasn't, an attack.
Yeah.
Right. So I really, people, pretty quickly pick that up, but so, yeah. That's good. And also I think the group really had to develop trust. Everybody had to develop trust in each other to write about their experience in prison. Because it's not a safe thing to do.
Yeah.
Right. So that took some years for several.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the best things that students that I've had said about the class is that they learned as much from each other as they did from me in the class, and I really felt that in the class that we had together. I thought we had an incredible amount of like the students just really challenge each other, learn from each other. And while what you say is right, I've also found that there's a certain kind of trust there too. So maybe just a comfort with talking about deep, hard topics, or there's also, I noticed in many of my classes, there's a surprising amount of respect for huge differences, just because you have to be able to navigate those differences for the reasons that you mentioned. So it actually creates an environment where you can have a lot of really big disagreements about very deep topics without people getting angry with each other.
Yeah, I think what that that thought and what Doran spoke about as far as trust is like, we're in an environment that its first priority is control, and its second priority is to like disunify opportunities for connection. And so like vulnerability, sharing, talking about your life are things that make people relatable and connect, especially when, their life experiences have like very same trajectories and interventions through the state. And when people could say, oh, wow, like I lived in the Bronx and you live in Buffalo, but like I went through the same stuff because of, poverty, education, these type of things. And so, and what happens is like, the prison system is really good at taking people's vulnerabilities and weaponizing them. And what I mean by weaponizing them is that, they will read your mail, they will listen to your phone conversations, they'll monitor your visits with your family, they'll listen to your conversations, they'll look into your background, they'll find any type of information that they can take and then spread amongst the other guards and then other incarcerated people who then will use that to like bully you, have you assaulted, violently beat up. And so people don't want to express those vulnerabilities. And even if the system was like, even if the prison system didn't do that, there's no infrastructure, there's no programming, there's no training to foster that type of reflection and conversation. So like I know I've been immensely blessed and lucky to be a part of the workshop and other places where I could sit down and learn to trust and like be vulnerable and talk about my life or listen to other people's lives. But a large number of people do not have that opportunity. They don't have the chance to to be in connection with other people and say like, yeah, I relate, or like, yeah, this is what happened, or like, hey, I've never been through that, but like I feel really connected and hurt for you as well. So
You mentioned, and I'm really glad you did, that prison creates isolation between even the people in prison. You, of course, talk a ton in all of your work, but especially here about the isolation that prison creates between the people behind the walls and the people outside the walls. Not just a physical isolation, but a really deep emotional and spiritual isolation. One that you point out here allows people outside to imagine themselves like virtue, paragons of virtue, and everybody inside they dehumanize. One thing too, I wanted to add to that, another kind of separation is, of course, that only works if you don't know anybody in a prison, as we've talked about. And there are, of course, many Americans who do know and love people in prison. And it seems like, so there's a kind of chasm that is created too by prison between the people outside the walls who know people in prison and love them and know what's going on and can relate, and those that don't and have no idea, and it's a completely different world. So there's all these kinds of ways that the carceral state creates these rifts between people inside, outside, and inside from outside. Of course, there's also the relationship between the people who work in a prison, the correctional officers, and the people who are oppressed by them. And so there's just so many ways in which it divides, right?
Yeah, and that, when I say in the book, and as you say regularly, that the public doesn't know about what goes on in prison. Well, parts of the public don't know. Right. Big parts of the public do know. Right. This is very much a part of their lives. It's their cousins, their brothers, their daughters, who go into the system. But there, the divide is basically geographic, right? Because there's such a segregated country, right? And it's divided by class, right? You'd be going to a coffee shop, and be served by a person who's got a cousin in prison, right? But you're not going to have that conversation with them.
Yeah.
At that moment, the class difference,
Right.
interaction, don't interact across classes. So the information is out there, but there are all kinds of visible and invisible ways of keeping people from actually talking about this. And it's remarkable a couple of instances I've known people who before had really typical ideas about prisons, and then they have one family member who gets caught up in the system. Boy, they turn around fast. I mean, it's like, wait a minute, I had no idea that these court systems work this way, that the police work this way, that prisons work this way, and suddenly they're converts.
Well, I mean, I think it really does. The reason for that is simply that the whole thing requires genuine dehumanization of everybody in the prison. So it only works, as you pointed out, if you really don't know. But it only takes one time to meet somebody who lives in a prison, and it's like, oh, it is a person, and come to care about them, and then that whole illusion is suddenly shattered.
That when I was growing up in Southern California, there are deep racial divides, but where I was, it was not black-white, it was brown-white. And I always, tell my students this experience. When I was 8 years old, a friend of my brother's, older brothers from around the corner, had just been a screw up, most of his life. He was always getting in trouble, but he became a cop. And he came by the house, he was in his uniform and his cruiser, he was throwing the football back and forth. It's like, yay, I'm somebody at authority. So he leaves. I go through the greenhouses, go to see my friend Phil Castillo, who lives in it's called Barrio, right? And I'm sitting there, going to have dinner with them. We're sitting there at the table, and the spotlight comes blasting through the front window. And they thought nothing of it. I thought, well, what's that about? I says, oh, that's Officer Iden. He does it on every street here. So he's throwing the football with us, and he's got a spotlight shooting every house on the street when he goes over to that neighborhood. Right? So I happened to be there, so I saw the sort of obvious contrast. But otherwise, there would be no way. It's from a solid middle class white neighborhood. You can see that.
One question that was kind of like a hobby horse of mine that I've actually talked to you a little bit about, but I was reminded of it by some of the testimony in your books, but also by your, the analogy, the fourth city analogy, or did you say now it's third city?
Fourth City.
So it's fourth city still.
It's actually the fifth city now. Prisons have gotten smaller. Houston's
Right.
grown, so.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
if
I
you-
guess
if-
both of those are good
If
things.
you had people on parole, right, and all
Yeah.
that, I mean,
Yeah.
it is the largest metropolis, yeah.
Right, and again, also people who are touched by incarceration who are not actually inside, but so, and you said, well, you motivated the idea of this book by saying, well, if you want to learn about Chicago, you know, ask people in Chicago what it's like to live in Chicago. And it reminded me of this question, this tension that I kind of was talking about with Jose recently, where we had a student a couple of years ago who said that the terms homework and take-home tests were very painful. And so we advised instructors to stop using them. And the idea, of course, which comes across here is, this is not home, right? And if anything, this is the opposite of home. It's keeping me from home. I want to go home. But then at the same time, I've seen students, you know, I've heard students talk about making potluck, you know, Thanksgiving, Christmas meals together. We were talking the other day that you had a years-long D&D campaign going, and also the language of the prison, right? The police, the COs or the police, like it, so that in a sense that is your neighborhood. So that I'm kind of curious about that tension, and maybe I'll actually start by asking you this, Jose, and also if you saw that theme emerge in your testimonies.
Yeah, you do, like, you try to resist thinking of prison as your only place, and some don't. Some, you know, because of the time that they've been sentenced to, you know, 150 years to life for a second-degree murder, while the guy next to them has 15 to life for a second-degree murder. You know, the expectation for freedom is not there. So, you know, like this is the rest of my life. I'm living here, and so I'm going to conduct myself and think of this environment as my home. Which does a lot of, like, it creates a lot of weird dynamics because just it's a lot. It's a lot. I'll say personally, I've never once thought of prison as my home. I just couldn't. And even with the reality that I could die in prison, I never once thought of it as my home. And it was largely in part because I watched all the stuff that was going on around me, especially at the hands of the guards and the staff. And my idea of home, even though it was never like this great safe place, it wasn't prison. And so I did my best to resist talking about, like, you know, referring some of the cell as like back at my spot or my home or my like I would be really conscious of how I refer to even my own possessions, you know, because technically they weren't really mine, even though I had them. They could be taken at any moment. But I think of you know, if a study was done on this, I think like this is like the phenomenon of the internalization of place in like situation of like selfdom. I think within facilities, and I think even not just correctional facilities, but like nursing homes and other places where there's the thing. I think it would be really interesting to discover how there is an intentionality and how these environments are created to get you to think of them as these places as another form of control. And so, you know, I don't know. I don't have the language, and I don't have the you know, the knowledge to express it. But I know within myself, I felt that, and I resisted it, you know, as often as I possibly could.
That's such a violence in itself, right? It's especially given that you have relationships with the people around you?
There's a great novel, Malcolm Braley. It's called On the Yard. It's a film made of it later on. I recommend it to anyone, but it's largely about institutionalization and the degrees of institutionalization among the men at least in San Quentin. So, one of the main characters is this fellow who's trying to resist, right? It's like, I'm not part of this, I'm educating myself. I'm not part of the markets, all things are going on. And, he's unsuccessful, down to a character who, been there, been inside for like 70 years, insanely, and believes that these portraits in one of these rooms of Lincoln and Emerson, those must be all past wardens, because he can't imagine a world, outside an institution. And Ken Hartman, great memoir, Mother California, he had a life without possibility of parole sentence, and he has a passage in the book where he's talking about imagining breaking out. But what he imagines is going on a crime spree and then going down in a hail of bullets. It's like, now my prison reputation would be fixed. They would never forget. Like, he literally could not imagine a life outside. It would just be about creating a reputation that would create, his reputation inside. So, there's all these different degrees that way. The thing that's also, I think, important to keep in mind is that the staff there, for them, that's also a third of their day, if not more. And they're essentially trying to make their lives peaceful, right? To some degree, right? They're obviously doing a lot of agitation as well, but they want every day to look exactly like the next day, right? So when I talk to people about starting work in prisons, I say, just show up. Just show up. Keep going in. Make yourself familiar. Turn yourself into the wallpaper. And then you could do, things you want to do. Because the machine is just built on routine. It just wants everything the same day after day after day. And you've got human beings who are trying to give some sort of variety to their lives, against all those trends.
Can I add also?
I want to hear what you think.
So the potluck thing. So that does happen. Yeah. So that's our resistance. That's our way of maintaining our humanity and our connection and our sanity is we make friendships, we make these connections with people that we're doing time with. I have a friend here who, I know personally and consider like family because we're there 24/7. And so when you're around each other and you see each other through all of the emotional spectrums and experiential spectrums of life, you get to know each other. And, so part of, I think, resisting that institutionalization is finding those moments of humanity and connection. So it might be playing some Dungeons and Dragons. It might be playing some chess. It might be making, a jailhouse meal together with whatever you can put together and enjoying it with a friend, that's the way that you experience, your sanity. And, that's hard because, every institution is in many ways its own country and they run and they're designed differently. And so, for example, Attica is designed, and especially after the 71 uprising, run to be very, very segregated and controlled. And so it's much harder to make these connections. And then you have the Dannemora escape, which now, the Department of Corrections instituted a policy that every year you must be moved from the cell that you are in to another cell. And so people, so if you've never been in prison, you might not understand why that. It is like moving your whole house from one place to another every single year. So that's like new neighbors, figuring out where the store is or whatever, figuring out the lay of the land, who's the people you can trust, who are the people you got to watch out for, which also breaks up opportunities for connection and growth and things like that. But you do make those opportunities, and so you have those pop-ups and watch the classic image of somebody holding a mirror out of the cell to look down the gallery, like, that's true, but we also use it to look at each other. So, this very thin metal wall that is separating you and I, that prevents us from seeing each other. I just put a mirror out and then we see each other and we talk. And maybe I have a TV and I invite you to watch my TV with me. And you have some food and like, all right, I'll bring the food, I'll bring the TV. And so that's how we maintain our sanity.
I was just thinking when you were talking that I was talking to somebody who was formerly incarcerated, and I called, and his wife was saying, "Oh, I'm making him his prison spaghetti." So like he had like this developed nostalgia for this particular thing, the spaghetti that was made with like the kind of the stuff that you could get from the commissary. Okay, so maybe actually in the name of time, I'll ask a question I definitely want to ask, and then we can maybe open it up to questions. So I want to close with a question that was asked by the other member of your outside reading group, David. So David has been incarcerated for over 20 years, during which time he has actively participated in community outreach programs aimed at enlightening youth about the impact of incarceration. He's also a skilled leather craftsman and the co-founder of Change Comes From Within, an anti-violence initiative dedicated to fostering safer communities in the Buffalo and Rochester areas. And David writes, do you feel that prison reform is a taboo topic? If so, why, and how can we change that? You're no stranger to prison politics. It's so depressing and disappointing. So maybe we can kind of end on a more forward-looking note. You did actually address this a bit in what you were discussing. What a way forward might look like.
Well, the message of the book is the way forward needs to be led by incarcerated people, right? They know what's wrong, they know what's right, they know how it works, they know what doesn't work, they know what's constructive, they know what's constructive. And I don't presume to do more than to try to get their writing before people who can make decisions about how things work, right? To try to move public opinion. So the greatest source of hope that I find is simply incarcerated people. I mean, they are incredibly large and incredibly untapped resource for understanding not just problems in prisons, right? But these are often folks who have been through all of the civil failures that we scratch our heads again, about every day. Like, how are we going to deal with what's wrong with the foster care system, right? What's wrong with not getting, addiction treatment to the public? What's wrong with the welfare system? These people have been through all these systems. They've experienced all these failures. So instead of people on the outside saying, "Oh, maybe we'll try this," or "Maybe we'll try this," like you're trying to start a clock inside of, a black bag, right? And say, well, why don't we open the bag and have people inside put this thing together, right? Because they know what the parts are and what really needs to be changed. So, it's frustrating, right? Because that's such a big ask. But the fact that the potential is there, I find, incredibly, inspiring. Because, just what Jose was saying tonight, right, would be a revelation to a lot of people who actually have the authority to actually make changes inside about what keeps people human, what keeps them on track for moving forward. And that potential is there. It's in you, it's in every person that's inside the system.
Think about that question.
Way forward, I feel like the simplest way to get to one point to another is a straight line. So I'll just straight line it to like, the way forward is there are many organizations across the state and country that are doing great work. Not just organizations. I'm all for that, but just people. Find them. Find the person, even if it's just one person or two persons or an organization that's doing this work in relationship to those who are directly impacted. And then just jump in. You know, I mean, there's a whole bunch of them, and I think that's the best thing I could tell anybody. Is like, what do I do? Just get involved, make some relationships, make some connections, and you know, it'll go from there. And then you know, one day we may not be having these conversations anymore. Be something related but different.
Thanks. We should open up for questions. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing, all of your thought pieces. I think, so I have layers of sort of things going through my mind, in connection to this discussion and the American, I guess, us living in the imperial core of the United States and the system that does exist, which is a very broken system. And as this gentleman was talking about, kind of people who have been through that system and through all of the systems, because I do believe they're very much connected, whether we're talking about people who are in poverty, fall through the cracks, whether they have committed crimes or not committed crimes. The American system was built, the carceral system specifically was built to punish and to continue to punish, right? And to punitively punish people and not allow them to regain their humanity and to regain, I guess, I mean, I'm no expert, but I do wonder, while you were in prison or in certain systems, are you allowed to read books like Malcolm X? Are they allowed to read books by George Jackson? I'm glad that you mentioned, because George Jackson was actually a prolific young man who spoke about Palestine in the 70s, spent many years in the prison system here, became educated in that system, learned Arabic, translated poetry from Arabic to English, and then ended up dying in that system. But in his short time, he was able to make those connections and kind of, link the larger picture, because there is a larger picture to be linked, right? And so, and I do have to mention, especially with the encampment that's happening, the political prisoners in Palestine, they're very much all connected. And a lot of the prisoners, including a lot of child prisoners, and which is also a very important topic. We're talking about people who are underage too, who have been caught in the system unfairly. What is the answer for them? So yeah, I guess, sorry, I'm kind of all over the place, but we really have to make these links because we're talking about a system that was designed to be this way. It was designed to be as broken as it is, and there is no reform. There is none. There's no reform in that. It must be taken down and somehow, I don't know, rehabilitated in a completely different way. Because I don't have faith that the carceral system can be reformed. I don't think so. And we see now also with, what just happened at UCLA just yesterday with the police attacking the students, arresting the students, and this is happening in other encampments as well. We live in a police state, and depending on what the issue is, that's when it's a problem. That's when these are criminals. That's when we have to crack down, right? So it is this shift in consciousness and narrative, which is very, very important. But 100% I agree. It has to come from the people who have been fighting and within the system, whether we're talking about here or abroad, because their stories are, there's no one else that can tell their stories the way that they can, and teach us the way that they can, including many of the political prisoners. And so, I guess I'm just wondering, are prisoners here even allowed to or have any sort of connection to prisoners abroad and their writings and what they're going to, because there's so many, and there's so many incredible maybe not archived within the university, but narratives now, especially with social media, things have changed, things are changing. Yeah, so I hope that was coherent.
I mean, so yes, we can have access to like prison literature and other things, but you're not gonna find the Soledad brothers around the
Okay.
corner. Like it's so rare. It's really, really rare. What you'll find often is like somebody had it, they like photocopied it somehow, I'm not gonna say how, but they photocopied it, and then they like smuggling it through the facility. Or like, I'll give you my own personal example. So like, I'm Puerto Rican and I didn't know anything about my Puerto Rican history until I went to prison. And my neighbor was like, "You Puerto Rican?" I was like, "Yeah." And I said, "No, I don't." He's like, "What?" He's like, "Hell no." And he like, this big, huge roll of paper, right? And he's like, "Write this down." And what it was literally a history book of Puerto Rico handwritten, all about the revolutionary movements of Puerto Rico. And I'm like, "You want me to write this whole thing down? This is a book." He's like, "Yeah, it's literally the whole book." I said, "Well, give me the book." And he's like, "No, you got to write it down." And I wrote it down. Plus I was scared. So I was like, I'll write it down. I got you. But, and that's not just the prison system. It's the control of who tells the story. And that's why I think, what I got out of the writing workshop is that your story matters is so important. Like all of our stories matter. And when you come up against a force that is trying to repress your story, then that's a very serious problem. And you have to ask yourself, what are you getting out of my story being silenced? And so we have to provide opportunities for people to tell their stories. And it's everybody in this room, and it's everybody in the quad, and it's everybody across the nation, across the country. So we can, but it's sanitized, and every now and then you get something that slips through.
Yeah.
It's
There's a book, just really quickly called The Trinity of Fundamentals. It's it was, they loosely kind of, the man who wrote it, it's a very interesting way in how he was in the prison system in Palestine for a long time, in and out. And the way that he would have to write whatever came to his mind in that moment. Otherwise, he said, I can't do it. And they would smuggle rolls of paper and send them to different people and stuff them in their, I don't know what. And eventually it took years, I think, for them to bring us the story together. So I would definitely recommend,
We just got that book. We just got it.
Amazing.
Okay, so
There's something, that's something, that book is incredible. There's a point I wanted to make about that process, but when it comes back to me, I will.
yeah,
think of
I
it.
just
Yeah,
wanted
it's
to
phenomenal.
mention that very much the man who wrote that book, exactly what you were kind of mentioning.
But that's interesting because that book is a fictionalized memoir too. So he does a little bit of that where he wants to compile different stories over time. So he puts it as one of these like fictionalized memoirs that also takes liberties to, teach you things, but in this like creative writing way through the real process of that is fascinating.
Very interesting.
Oh, that was the point, is the politicalization of people in prison. So that became, this is how I heard that story about the book, was that when people get incarcerated in prison, Palestinians in Israeli prisons, they have like a curriculum already. It's like, this is what we're going to radicalize people in the prisons because, you've been like abandoned, they don't care at that point. And they just leave people, Palestinians, and they say, kind of like you're saying, we're going to teach you this history. And that was one of the books that he said, they're reading my book as he didn't know it was even completed at one point. And they were reading this book in the curriculum of like the works, I shouldn't say radicalization, it's like history, knowing, like being able to tell your story. But that was a very interesting aspect of how, because that happens in our prisons too, right?
Yeah, and it's amazing to me too, because I've read the synopsis of the book and kind of how it came about, but especially in these Israeli prisons because they're so bad. I mean, they're so bad. And a lot of our political prisoners who are very learned, they took the time to get their degrees and write these books. I mean, they do end up dying in prison from cancer, from neglect, medical neglect, all of these things. In the end, many of them do. So it's just kind of amazing to me that they were able to even have that journey along the way, considering the conditions that they're under, considering the other their ailments, considering so many things. So yeah, it blows my mind. Yeah. So
Let me say on the point of George Jackson, people have actually been accused of gang activity just for having George Jackson's work, because there's the George Jackson Brigade, which actually continued in California prisons after that. And my experience is with the college programs I've organized, the one locally to where Hamilton is, they've actually been quite good at saying, if this is for the college program, we're going to give you a pass, on the work. In general, though, for example, I wanted to bring in a collection of Langston Hughes short stories. Right? Person in the side just opened it at random and saw a description of a lynching. And says, no, this is not going in. As though people inside don't know the lynchings took place, right? So the attitude is essentially, we've got these people who are not rational human beings. We don't want to poke them, right? By giving them stories about lynching, about racism, et cetera, because then they will act up. So it's really not, it's part of the whole package. It's just not treating incarcerated people as rational thinking people. They're just potential sources of energy that can be overstimulated, right? And then they're gonna, as though you're gonna make them, right?
Reminds me of Thomas's story about the eclipse. So is that what you're thinking too?
Yes.
That during the eclipse, one of our colleagues, Thomas, he was at Attica in a previous eclipse, and they told them that and actually, like this year, they locked down all the New York prisons so they couldn't see the eclipse. But last time when Thomas was there, they told them that they couldn't go outside during the eclipse because they were going to look at the eclipse to purposefully damage their eyes, as if you couldn't just do that on a normal day. So that's like really, really illustrative of that. Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I really appreciate your interventions and the questions about sort of reformism and abolition and the ways in which those of us who work to build higher ed prison programs are participating in an essentially reformist enterprise, right? While many of us are abolitionists at heart, it troubles the sleep, right? You get featured on the Doc's website, and that's the last place in the world where I want my name, but there we are, right? So, that these questions are very real for me, and I think that the way you're bridging them to sort of anti-colonial work across the globe is really important. My question actually though goes way back to the beginning about testimonial. I've been teaching writing in jail and prison settings for more than 20 years, and one of the things that I would be really interested to hear both Doran and Jose talk about is the ways in which some kinds of stories are in fact authorized by the system. Many incarcerated people whom I've encountered arrive in my writing class with an expectation that the story I want is the one that they've been told to tell at a parole hearing or told to tell in a 12-step meeting about a sort of journey from brokenness to healing. And that's the least, in many ways, relevant story for the work that I'm eager to do with those folks, right? I mean, of course, I'm not denying the agency of the story that they have, but it's a story that is produced under a kind of pressure that I want to free my class from rather than reenact. And so I'm curious what you think about testimonial as a mode of storytelling, given those kinds of pressures to tell stories in other sites within the institutions.
I didn't run into that in the class at Attica or other places I taught. I think only because people had really long sentences and they really weren't thinking immediately, about parole hearings and like. Their expressions were largely, some reductive characterization, just like being pissed off about the system. And I hear that, I've heard that from many people saying, it took me 10 years, it took me 12 years, it took me 15 years to start thinking about how I was responsible for why I'm here, because they spent the rest of the time being pissed off about the response to whatever the crime had been, right? And it just takes you a while to get through the, get over the anger and the resentment even, as I mentioned, people either like take full responsibility for their crimes, but this is not the answer to it, right? So those are narratives that, these men are talking about, or, very specific things, right? And we get in the archive, with the archive, our solicitation is really wide open. The only criteria is that it's based on first person experience. So people talk about their homes, they talk about how their court, treatment in court, they present ideas for, curricula for inside. I mean, it's really, really wide range. And the only places where you consistently see positive statements about what's going on is with those people who are engaging in that kind of reform, and largely volunteers, not the institutional, offerings. And that's clearly, they all sort of framing that as in the exception to what the ethos of the institution is itself, right? So it's critical, almost universally, and where it's not critical, it's about something that's clearly resisting the larger ethos of the institution. Yeah, and I'm just not seeing a piece which is clearly looks like the kind of thing that somebody would be presenting to a board, right? Some of those have that effect, right? Saying people mature, they grow up. I used to do this, I used to think this way, now I think this way. But it's certainly not written in a way that you would present to that body. That's an important question.
Yeah, I have a thought and a question. And I stated this: the prison industrial complex is a smaller version of a larger trauma. So to my brother over there, from the age of 16 to being released, what was surprising about your integration back into society?
What was surprising about it? Oh gosh. It's a long list of stuff, but so I'll give you one positive one and one negative one. So I'll start with the negative one. The negative one probably is that no, it's not probably, is that there is no mental health infrastructure that is designed around working with people who have been in institutions. A lot of the theoretical frameworks do not center life in an institution, especially with the social conditionings that lead people to those places. Like we were instructed to teach Kohlberg's theory of moral development, which was designed by a white man who studied young white boys in the suburbs. And then we as incarcerated peer educators were asked to use this as a model to help people to elevate their moral development. And then I'm like, are you serious? Nobody relates to this. This has nothing to do with our life experiences. So I've been advocating that initiative be started that tracks incarcerated individuals that are in college programs into as they're incarcerated and then they're released into the therapeutic field, into the mental health field, right? And then provide them the opportunity to develop a therapeutic model that centers incarceration. Because there's nothing, I'm lucky that I came across the therapist I came across that understood, and it's only because he worked within the system, but only as a consultant. He's like, I was only a consultant. I just want to let you know that. He's like, I hated it, but he understood. So that's the negative. The positive I would say is that the other day, my wife, Dawn, and I were at a family friend house who were supporting for parole release. And we're sitting there and I got my little computer right there and I got my glasses on, and I'm taking notes. And one of the family members comes in and we're talking. He's like, once they figured out I was formerly incarcerated, like, no, I thought you was the lawyer. You're all sitting there with the computer. So the great thing is I don't fit the typical stereotypical idea of what a person who's been in prison looks like. I'm sure there's some images, but so I like not being, obviously formerly incarcerated, but I mean, I even though I use that as my credibility for a lot of the stuff I work, it makes me feel like, okay, I have some kind of normalcy, that's visible. So.
So,
So I will ask a question with a little bit of preface. I grew up in the Soviet Union in the late 19 fell apart. So in a sense, when I started teaching theology, I was like going to prison was kind of pathological, and it felt like I totally feel at home. I know how this works exactly at some molecular level. I kind of entered Soviet Union when I entered prison. And it's both disturbing, but it's also pathological because I never Soviet Union fell apart, but it's inside me. But you have been taught for 18 years as a child, as a young adult, with no promise of parole, with it fell apart. It was nearly a miracle to my parents' generation. So what is interesting to me once I kind of left and then I stopped traveling and keep having a great life, in a way it feels very surreal, because what feels real to me is Soviet Union. The rest of it is like a dream I have never deserved. So the question I wanted to ask, let's say you might need to ask, but it's like, if you left the prison, what happened to the prison left you? Have you felt like, okay, I'm done, this is a done chapter, I'm not part of it? It's a very surreal feeling for me, and I wish I am alone, that I talk to my fellow people who are in the same situation, and they say the same thing, exactly. Before that, that's the real reality. The rest of it is not real. But I have a very strange relationship with school teaching in a way, right? But I wanted to ask you, you are now freedom?
Well, I would like to say there's a stark difference between your reality and mine, is that you didn't have a choice. I had a choice, me specifically. There's thousands of Americans, hundreds of thousands of Americans who went through the prison system innocent. I'm not innocent. So, I made certain choices in my life that led me eventually down to these other choices that eventually brought me to prison, me specifically. So, but has it, I don't know, that goes back to the question of every environment that we grow up in conditions us to respond and move and to interact in that environment. And so I did it for 26 years, and I was doing things habitually that I never thought about, and literally never thought about. And then I come home, and now I'm it stops me because I'm like, wait a minute, why are you doing that? And then oh shoot, I used to do this. This is stuff I did in prison or whatever. Just thinking, even just thinking about things, or the way I might have my morning routine, or my expectation about going into public places or other things like that. So I would, no, it hasn't. There's definitely some effects that have happened through those years of conditioning. And so hopefully one day, hopefully soon, we will have, a large body of knowledge and understanding that we can provide help for people like me and others to get out of that, get that stuff out of us.
yeah,
Thank you for your comments, insights. I've been looking into and thinking through incarcerated folks on the inside who have wrote about abolition. I think there's definitely some writings, those like Jackson that be writing abolition slangs. And then there's more recent writings, folks like Stevie Wilson, Jamal. And I'm just wondering, historically, and just from experience, have you seen folks thinking through and writing about abolition? So they're
Well, I'll say that the work that comes in the archive, it's pretty rare, that people use the term. But particularly, politicized Black writers are very aware of the legacy that comes from slavery, right? And the original, forms of abolition. And so all of their resistance to this, they clearly, whether they use the term or not, see this as requiring a new abolition, right? If you don't get hung up on the term itself, you can see the sentiment that's there, right? Because they, as was mentioned, they're saying the system isn't broken. The system is doing exactly what it was set up to do, right? Essentially, it's a system of population control, not about crime control, right? And that goes back to, you look at the statistics in the very earliest experiments, right, in the penitentiary, with the majority of Black people, right? Really incredible numbers of Black women who were picked up in Philadelphia, in first prison experiments. So that's there. But like a number of things, it's that the people who are writing from inside have a sort of ground up organic sense of these ideas without having the exact language, right, that we tend to apply to it. And also, in a very broad sense of abolition, of saying what we need are communities that don't, require people going into illegal markets because they're free markets. They're illegal markets so they can work in, right? The disinvestment from certain communities needs to be fixed, right? So they're talking about all the things that abolitionists talk about, but they're doing it just directly responding to their own personal experience.
You have thoughts about that, Jose? It's not a word that came up but I would imagine it would be the same kind of story, like you and your.
I was fortunate. I grew up around some radical brothers inside and mentors that secreted away, so that brother George Jackson, Huey P. Newton. I still have my book of quotes that has some of their quotes in there. But no, I don't know. I don't know anybody. I haven't read anything that's coming out right now. That's like, that thing is fire right there. I could point out just some stuff that's coming out that's like, it's like GQ worthy. just to be putting a story out there, furthering stereotypes and stuff.
I wonder how many people just are abolitionists, but they don't have the word to put on it. I think we were talking before, like if you've gotten to the point that somebody and you care about somebody in a prison, you very quickly get to the point where it's like, this is an unacceptable institution. Obviously, it needs to be raised, and even if you have to build something else, like that's fine. But I think it doesn't take that much experience of it to think, yeah, this is not good, bad, go away.
Yeah, one of the things that the organizers of Free the People Rock were saying at the time of the Daniel Prude protest was basically, we've been here all along, abolitionists, white kids in the suburbs who are just showing up figuring this out.
Yeah.
And the vocabulary wasn't the same, but the impulse was there.
Yeah.
Thank you all for your time. It's 8:03. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. But if folks would like to stay around and have informal conversations with the panelists, and get their books on, please feel free to do so.
Thank you all.